Welcome back, everyone. We have another special guest with us today for, I think, the 10th interview on this channel. This is Evan Alexis. Nice to see you, Evan.
Hi, hi.
So, Evan was a former policy debater in both high school and college. He was the NSDA finalist in policy debate in high school. Also did a lot of debate in university. Now is coaching at WashU St. Louis, and taught at various camps, including VBI and some others. So, a very well-rounded policy debater and debate coach. So very happy to have you today to share your unique perspectives. My first question is how did you get into debate? What's your debate story?
Yeah, so I actually have a sort of funny debate story. It starts in high school, like most people, but I actually got into debate really late. So one of the reasons is, when I was in high school, I went to a really busy high school in the Bay, and I was so worried about getting overwhelmed by different activities, so I was sort of staying out of a lot of stuff. And so I kept getting pushed by like my sister and my mom and my friends. They're like, "You should do a debate. You should do a debate." And so finally, second semester of my junior year, I really get into it. This was on the immigration topic, and my local league is very lay and very competitive, and so I just get thrown into the meat grinder, and I sort of I enjoy it, but I don't even get to go to like state qualifiers the end of my junior year, and so I ended up enjoying debate so much that I went to camp and I went to GDI, go Zags, and I ended up coming back and then did okay. Went to a couple circuit tournaments that first semester, and then uh, it's 2020, so COVID hits, everything goes online. Our school basically just shuts down. They didn't really have any contingency
Mhm.
plan or anything. They're like no more school. So I was really bored. So I just ended up investing most of my time in debate. Ended up qualifying to nationals, and the rest is sort of history. Did really well and just kept sort of coaching debate, judging debate throughout my gap year, got really into it, and then started debating in college, really enjoyed it, and sort of went from there.
Nice. I feel like this is a very familiar story, especially among people of our age. I went through the exact same thing where I got into debate really in my junior year, and then COVID, I was bored out of my mind and really just sold my soul to the activity.
Yeah.
Um, I'm consistently surprised how many people become really great debaters and are really invested in coaching who start, you know, maybe they start very early, but they really get into it quite late, I think, in high school. Um,
Yeah. I actually think it makes a lot of sense. And one of the reasons is just thinking about how sort of maturity interacts with an
mhm.
activity like debate that's very metagame centric, right? And very community driven. Where if you get into debate where you're pretty young, you're impressionable, it's very easy to get led astray or led down the wrong
Mm.
path, and you get sort of fixed in your mindset, or you sort of learn the metagame at a level of abstraction that actually prevents you from understanding the fundamentals at like a really deep level. And so actually when some people are coming in a little later, they are a little older and they're not going to be as easily led off that path. And so I
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
find like the students who get into debate later end up understanding the fundamentals, maybe not better all the time, but they actually have an advantage in some ways.
Yeah, I feel like this is such a key. This is a theme that's been common throughout a lot of these interviews is what really makes the difference between good debaters and great debaters, I think is the critical thinking, being able
Yeah.
to stray from the norm. Look at all of the things that are happening on your circuit and say, no, actually, I think, that's not the way to do it. I think there are different ways that we can experiment. And maybe some of those go wrong, but some of them go right, and that's what makes you great.
Yeah, I think just to push back a little bit,
Mhm.
it's because I think that the opposite can be true, where a lot of people who try and stray from a norm can end up failing. And I think the real key is when you understand why the norm is the norm. That's what lets you successfully deviate from it,
Right.
right? Where it's just like you understand why people are doing the things in the metagame, then you understand how to actually break the metagame. If you're sort of following it sort of because that's what works and you're not really getting the underlying reasons, or you're blindly straying away from it, that's when it's not going to
Yeah.
work out.
Yeah. That's so true. You need a fundamental understanding of why people do what they do, and then you can break it. And I feel I guess one reason for this is judge psychology a little bit. Like, there's, I think people underestimate, especially people who are first joining debate and first getting to the national circuit, really underestimate the extent to which like supposedly very technical rounds are actually just decided by like the judge's intuitions based on their prior technical experience as well. Like which jargon they think is more attuned to the kind of argument that they like picking up. And even judges, I think, underestimate this effect as well. And so being able to like pander to what the judge understands technical debate as and then break it is like that's I think the requirement to have successful innovation.
Yeah. I don't want to. Maybe this is more relevant to a different question, but the thing I've been saying for the last year is debate is about the judge, right? And fundamentally, I think the largest mistake that debaters make is they think debate is about the other team. They think debate is about beating the other team and faking them out, messing them up, and that's just not the case. The person who decides the debate round is the person in the back of the room. They're going to be the one submitting the ballot, and so a lot of the time you'll be trying some sneaky thing and maybe it'll fake the other team out, but guess what? It'll fake the judge out too, and you will lose the round. And so that's really a fundamental lesson that I think even people with years of experience have a hard time grasping.
Yeah, 100%. I feel like even you can even take this to the extreme. Like I feel like there are rounds in which you could almost ignore the other team. Like not entirely.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think this happens, right? And especially with I think certain especially if you have like a mixed panel,
Mhm.
right? Of like more lay, more technical judges, like giving very direct judge instruction to the judges who you want their ballot, right, is so key and can really just steal rounds. Uh and it's not theft. It's not theft. You won that round, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even fraudulent, right? This is how the activity is actually supposed to work.
Right. That makes a ton of sense. I feel like, okay, there was this one policy round. I don't know if this is like famous or infamous or like if people know about it. Maybe it's not a round at all. It's like a recording of a 2AR on YouTube that goes for condo bad, I think. Where like the end of the 2AR is just like, I know your paradigm. I know you believe this.
Yeah, no. This is done. This is done, especially in college policy. I feel like
Yeah.
this is a thing, especially when it comes to. I haven't seen it as much with like, but sort of arguments that judges have some ideological predispositions towards.
Mhm.
So theory, critiques are the kind of arguments where it's just like you need to sort of level with the judge and be like, I'm gonna soul read you, and I know you don't want to do this, but here's why you have to, right? And
Yeah.
that's that level of instruction. I don't think you really see it at the high school level, mostly because I feel like high schoolers are not really, probably rightfully so, confident enough to address a judge like that. Like you really, the relationship between the debater and the judge is very
Yeah.
different at the high school level than the college level. Um, but some version of that, I think, is it could be pretty effective.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I feel like that really goes so far. Like, just appearing very reasonable, just being like, listen, like, I understand. I'm not stupid. Like, I know this is a weird position to be reading. One way to do this, that I think is particularly effective, is like, you can admit, like, look, this is a bad argument. They should have said all of these responses that you're thinking, but they didn't. And so,
Right. Yeah. This is something I've been talking to some LDers recently about, whether it's a little frustrated, where some judges will vote someone down, and in their RFD, they'll be talking about a 2NR that they should have given and
right.
didn't, right? And
Yeah.
so they'll basically give the 2NR for the other team if it's the kind of argument that they're sort of like predisposed to want to win almost. And so you have to be very explicit about being telling the judge what was and was not in your opponent's speech so they don't read stuff in for them.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, so next question, I guess. I like this though. I think it's good to get into these tangents. That's what's like valuable about these interviews. Um, how did you like learn debate? Like, what do you think was the most valuable resources for you in becoming better?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there are a couple different sources. So I think there's a couple different levels at which you can think about debate and improving at debate.
Hmm.
So I think the level of debate I'm best at is definitely strategy, right? This is the top level thinking about how are the arguments going to interact to win the round, right? At sort of like a macro level. And so I think part of this was judging, actually. I did a lot of judging, and uh, this is definitely the best way to understand how arguments interact, because you are literally having to interact them in order to
Right.
decide rounds in real time. And this is something that a lot of high schoolers don't really have access to, but I think judging practice debates, right, on your team is probably the best way to do this. For me, I didn't really get to do this until I was in college. Or over that gap year before college, which I felt really leveled up my debating. So that's why I felt like in high school I was actually pretty terrible. But in college I got a lot better. Also watching some YouTube videos. There's some really great lectures out there. I have some on my website. But especially like Klarman has this lecture, Debate 201, which even if you don't do policy, really, really helped structure how I think about debate. Have you seen this lecture?
I haven't seen this
Um,
particular one, no.
I'll give a little summary, like an
Yeah.
excerpt.
Yeah,
Um,
sounds good.
the most important concept for this that stuck with me is thinking about just the quality of arguments in debate, where you can kind of label arguments like A, B, and C, where A arguments are arguments that are close to capital T true, or at least very strong arguments. And so this really shapes the time allocation you need to do when you're responding to these arguments, where it's just like, I need 3 times the amount of time they spend on this. Otherwise, I'm just going to get clapped, right? And
Yeah.
so being able to go down and think about how much time you have to spend on arguments alone is something that's really crucial to think about, both when shaping how you're going to respond to arguments yourself, and also how to deal with your opponent's arguments. Like, what am I going to read, and how do I respond to what they're reading? Just that alone from that lecture makes the whole thing worth it.
Yeah, I mean for sure. I will like link that in the description. You mentioned that you have like a website of videos.
Yeah, I have a blog.
Oh shit.
I think it's still up. Yeah, so it was a parody of Lincoln Garrett's blog, Debate Musings. So I've Debate Ravings. It's kind of old. But I think I put a lot of work into the resources section, where there's a lot of really helpful uh, links and stuff. So for most of the stuff I'm talking about, I would check that out.
Nice. Yeah.
Any links that are to the blog, Lincoln Garrett's blog, you got to use archive.org because that site is down. But there's a lot of really good stuff, like Trufanov stuff on intrinsicness, which is probably not relevant for PF. But
I mean, hey, I feel like it's debate is debate, right? At some level, like all of this is interesting. Even just the way that you go about thinking about concepts in debate, even if not applicable, I think it's
okay,
helpful.
wait, let's go back to the question. So how do you get better at debate? So
Yeah.
I think thinking about debate, judging, and prepping makes you better at debate, because you have to think about how am I going to structure these arguments, how I'm going to answer my opponent's arguments, and that makes you think about mechanically how do arguments interact. In terms of speaking skills, I think there's sort of two sort of subdivisions. One is sort of speaking the technical skills in terms of like speaking drills and filler word drills and stuff like that. I think is pretty standard across all activities. I don't have anything too special. Over enunciation drill is goaded,
What's
but
that? What's the yeah?
so the over enunciation drill is this is not as relevant if you're not going as fast, but I think this one specifically is very good because it forces you to you over sort of linger on syllables for words. So I might be like, national, and it makes your mouth move in a particular way where if you're going to start speaking faster or even at like a fast conversational pace, you're articulating syllables uh, more clearly, and it helps your judges hear you. So I think that one is quite good.
I
Uh,
feel like that's important. People in PF have started like trying to pick up speed recently, but without the clarity part. And so
right. So the clarity people don't understand. Actually, this is something big. Is that people force speed and make themselves slower. Like so
true,
for
true.
like and I think a good example of this is when people do speaking drills, they'll often just do I'm going to speak as fast as I can for as long as I can, and then when my voice gives out, I'm going to do speaking drills tomorrow. And that's a terrible way to get faster, because first of all, you're not actually going to get faster if everything is a 10. right? If everything is 10 speed, you're not getting faster. So often I find that like if you go into your speaking drills the mentality of like I'm going to go at like a 7 and then you're able to actually modulate up, that sort of at least mentally is really helpful to actually increasing your clarity and your speed, because when you're speaking at a 7 you're also much more clear. So when you
Right.
sort of scale that up, it's going to be much better.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I mean, you wouldn't train for a marathon by just doing sprints every day. Like,
Right, exactly. Yeah, and focusing on endurance is good. Although there's a lot of resources out there on speaking drills. I think something else in terms of like thinking about speech structure is something you really need to practice, especially for rebuttals. Thinking about, I think weighing drills are obviously very good. Everyone does them at camp, but very few people actually take them into rounds. Like very
right,
few people will do weighing in the rounds, and I think it's really important to think about how weighing wins rounds. Right, that is how the round is won. Is you need to give the judge a mechanism for giving you the ballot, and
right.
so if you haven't told them how you should evaluate the debate, they have nothing to go off of. They'll just default to whatever the other team said, and you will lose the round.
100%. I want to talk about weighing. Let's come back to it after the next
Okay.
one.
Yeah. Uh, the last thing I want to think about is like strategy. So often when I think about strategy, it's a mix of the two, where it is what is the speech? What is the final rebuttal that I want to come out of my mouth? And that is this combination of what is the macro level? Like, what are the arguments I need to have introduced in the debate in order to be able to say the things I want to say in the rebuttal? And also, how am I going to frame that last rebuttal so the judge will vote for me? And so
Right.
this is sort of bringing it all together, right? Where it's just like you need the combination of the strategy and, weighing and giving the speech.
100%. Okay, I just took some notes. So I have three things to say really quick. One, going all the way back to judging rounds makes you better at debate. Agree. I think if you don't have practice rounds on hand to judge it in your own team, you should judge YouTube rounds. Like there are a million
Yes.
rounds. Like I think there are two interesting ways you can do this because a lot of people do this, but I think you can do this in cool ways. One, you should not only practice judging PF rounds, even if you're a PFer. You should practice judging other formats as well. And then compare your RFD to the actual RFDs if they're also recorded. And number two, I think that a lot of people, when they're first beginning judging, they compare their RFD to the actual decision, and then they pretend that the actual decision is like the correct answer, and so they test themselves off of it. This is not the way to do it. I think that you should practice like arguing with other judges' RFDs, even if you think they're smarter than you, and like practice the act of justifying why you think your decision in a round is better than another judge's decision or adheres to a more coherent paradigm or whatever. And maybe you're wrong about a lot of this. You probably will be. But this practice of trying to justify your decision will make you into a better debater. Like that's the entire point of debate, is just sort of mirroring that exact thing. Number two, you just talked about like imagining the perfect rebuttal, the perfect like 2AR or whatever. And then I think prepping for that. I think this is like such good advice. PFers need to do this. One thing that I teach my students is like you should prep backwards. Like think about the
Yeah,
end of the round
absolutely.
and then do everything like there is no such thing as a good 1AC. In PF, there's no such thing as a good constructive. There's no such thing as a good rebuttal. We use rebuttal as the second speech. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
like these things don't exist as good speeches in isolation. The only way you can give a good front half speech is if it makes the back half easier. Like that is the only way it can possibly give you.
Yeah. I'm
Uh,
going to talk about this more when it comes to substance on the nuke stuff.
Perfect. Love that. And the number three thing, this is what we can dig into a little bit more. I'm so fascinated with weighing in policy. I have, I may be a misunderstanding. I'll tell you my current understanding of how weighing is working descriptively in policy. And I'll tell you why I think that maybe is not the best way. This is kind of takes from a someone who's outside
Sure.
looking at. My current understanding of how weighing tends to operate in policy is that everything links to extinction. This is putting aside different pre-fiat layers like theory and case. This is putting aside,
Sure. Yeah. We're
um,
just thinking impact
right,
calculus.
just impact calculus. So everything leads to extinction. There are, I guess, a couple different dimensions. Um, Basically, like your argument either has defense on it or it doesn't, and we can measure how big the defense is, like how much the mitigation applies. Like, do you have impact defense? Like, do you read bunkers means nuke war doesn't cause
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's like number one, and that's a way that some people use to tie break between extinction scenarios. A second way is like time frame, like, oh, mine comes
Sure.
first, yours comes later, so like this matters more. And then I don't know how else like policy debaters compare them other than just like mine is more true than yours because like it has less defense on it. I don't know how
Okay, so
weighing
yeah,
works.
yeah, yeah. There's a couple of things in there. So first, I think there is a cult of time frame that is sort of very real in policy, very fraudulent in my and I think a lot of other people's opinions because clearly if both of them are going to happen, right, in one world and another, like the time frame doesn't matter that much. And so no one is actually weighing like, okay, yours happens in 5 years, yours happens in 10 years. So that 5 years of life is super valuable. And here's how we should
Yeah,
understand that.
right.
No one is saying that. They're just like asserting that because there's a time frame differential, one matters more. And I think that's just not the case. Now, the real time frame stuff that's very important is when it comes to arguments like Turn's case, right? Where
Right.
if there are these generally, like let's say it's a case versus a disadvantage, or this might be a contention versus a contention. I don't know what the terminology in PF is.
Yeah, that works.
Um, Something like that. There's going to be link arguments that might implicate the other person's advantage, right? Where if it's just like if something links to something else, then time frame matters a lot, right? Because if your plan is solving nuclear war, but it triggers sort of a collapse of faith in our alliances that triggers proliferation before your solvency, then time frame matters a lot. Right? So I think that's a real case. Some other things for weighing probability. So this is, I think, closer to what you're talking about, where it's just like, what is the truthiness of your argument? So I think some place where probability is really important is impacts like warming, right? Warming is something really hated by the cult of time frame because it has a pretty obscure timeline. Um, and I think the best way to weigh warming is honestly to go for more indirect impacts, where warming triggers all of these sort of conflicts in the world,
Right.
water shortages, food shortages, all this stuff. We'll get to that on the substance probably more. But when you're weighing warming itself as a sort of terminal impact, something to say is, your scenarios are just cooked up by these policy hacks, right? We've never had a nuclear war. We have robust, scientific evidence that this is actually going to kill us all. And so this is where probability comes in, where it's not necessarily the probability of you've conceded in the round, so it's 100%,
Right.
but thinking about what is the actual probability
Right.
of an
Right.
event like this happening.
So I've heard this take from a lot of people in both policy and PF. Honestly, maybe more prevalently in PF, is that people say probability weighing is fake because it requires judge intervention or requires an appeal to some defense that was in the round that can just be answered. I agree with you. I don't think it is. I think there are baseline probabilities. But what do you think you would say to these naysayers who say like probability is just judge intervention?
So I think that it's a little more nuanced because I really see where people are coming from. And I think part of this has to do with the structure of a debate round and how these weighing arguments are introduced, right? Generally, weighing arguments are introduced in the last two speeches. And so they are effectively new arguments. And so there's a case to be made that making a probability type argument like I just did about warming is not necessarily appealing for judge intervention, but making effectively a new argument about the impact scenario itself. Now, I don't think it is because I think when you're talking about these sort of impacts, one of the reasons why it's legitimate to make new framing arguments and new impact calculus, right, is that the impacts themselves are already in the round, floating around there beforehand. So it's
Right.
more of a question of how the judge should prioritize things. And it seems to me that, like, the quality of being from Rand Corporation or the quality of being from scientists is just a property of your evidence that was conceded by the other team, right? And so it's not totally new or illegitimate to be making appeals to that when talking about probability.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And another way to put it maybe is like this is a half-baked take, so let's see if it actually sticks. It seems like the argument that says all probability weighing claims are new because they rely on like a new premise could also be equally applied to almost all kinds of weighing that are not probability.
Yeah.
Like a lot of I mean, what? Like magnitude comparisons, time frame comparisons, like I think those also implicitly are relying on like a new claim in the round that your time frame is late or your magnitude is low for some other reason. Um, it's like a little bit iffy because I think
Yeah,
people,
but I think those were already in the round though, right? So
yeah,
I think
right,
that's why the
right, right.
argument fails,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
but that reason why that reason why we are allowed magnitude and time frame weighing also means that we are allowed probability weighing.
Yeah, there's nothing unique about probability weighing. It doesn't make any sense why it would be.
100%.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I totally agree with that.
Okay, cool. Next, next question for you then. Um, what would you say is your best advice for your past self, like in high school learning debate? If you could like go coach the past Evan, how would you coach him and what would you say?
That's really funny. I think I would definitely have different answers for college me and high school me. So high school me, it's kind of tough because I was really new. I only really had a year and a half. So when it came to thinking about debate, I think honestly it would have been hard to like get me to be much better than I was. I think just probably put in more practice, right? Put in more hours of actually debating. Like I think that's the biggest thing is like not getting enough reps in, and so I wasn't as familiar with these arguments. But I think I could have taught myself debate in terms of like I really didn't have an understanding of the mechanics of the arguments at all that much when I was in high school, and I started getting at a level of abstraction when I was prepping for nationals and stuff like that. But I still didn't really understand why I was putting the things I was putting in the files. So it wasn't really until I started judging and started seeing it from the other side that I started really understanding the mechanics. In terms of college me, finish your files. Finish your files. Like, don't a file half cut is no file at all, right? It is a file in your head, in evidence based activities. And so it is much more important to have a workable file that you have finished than a file that is half cut and empty. Now, this is not saying you should not be cutting new evidence and like all that stuff. Absolutely not. But I think there is a value of completion for people like me who never finish anything.
That's so fair. This is an interesting thing as well because in PF we don't really like the concept of a file is a little bit foreign. It's not totally foreign. Like we still prep. I mean, hey, it's still an
Yeah.
evidence-based activity. We still cut cards. But I guess there are two reasons that it's a bit more foreign. One is that we only have topics for like a month, and so it's
Yeah.
not quite so important. And two is that I think that I think maybe this is a good thing, but this might be controversial. I think that there's a
Sure.
lot less emphasis on generics in PF. Like you don't necessarily recycle the same evidence for most topics. And the reason behind that is we haven't yet gotten to the policy state where like there are back files that you could have for everything because people are not reading the same like impact scenarios or the same like core disads and advantages on every topic. And so I think PF topics repeat themselves slightly less, at least in the debating of them, than policy topics.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think part of this, I don't know when you want to talk about this, but it's due to the structure of the activity, right? I think both like how resolutions are structured and I think this is like crazy, but pro con versus affirmative negative is a massive difference. It is a massive difference.
Wait, let's talk about that. I think now is the perfect time.
Okay,
What's the difference?
so let's think to where do debate norms come from, right?
Right.
So debate norms come from three places. They come from the rules of the activity in the NSDA rulebook. They come from the tournament invite, which is on Tabroom, and they come from the debate community. And this last category is actually incredibly suspect because, as many people have talked about, right, this is not a predictable source of norms, especially for people who are newer coming to the activity, right? And
Right.
so it's the norms that come from the community are like it's kind of like the naturalistic fallacy in a sense, which is just to say that like the norms that are out there in the community, just because they exist doesn't mean they're good and doesn't mean they're predictable, right? And so really when it comes to how do we predict in advance before any debate has happened how we ought to debate, we have to be looking to these sources of rules. And so there are a couple things in those rules that give us guidance about these things.
Hmm.
So one of them is the fact that there is a resolution, right? And there's a resolution in LD, policy, and PF. And the resolution uses the word resolved, which is used to indicate what you're going to debate about. And so there's a heavy indication that you're going to be debating about the proposition that follows the word resolved. But the way you debate a proposition also really matters in what kind of proposition it is and what the burdens are affiliated with that. So in policy, this is kind of going to get into the logic weeds a little bit, but the resolution is an existential statement. What that means is it means that something exists. And so if it's the United States federal government should do X, it means there's a way in which the United States federal government could do X and they should do it. So, for example, like substantially reduce its arms sales was the topic that I debated when I was in high school. And there's a lot of different ways they could reduce their arms sales that would prove that existential statement true. Because you only need to identify one way in which we should do it. This is how plans work in policy.
Right.
And
so, sorry, just to be
yeah,
clear, when you say existential statement, just one more time, I think
yeah,
what you're saying is the topic really means there exists a form of this policy that is
correct.
good.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. It's like there is a way that they could do it and should do it, right?
Right.
So the could do it is important because this is the ought implies can principle, which
Yeah.
just is that it needs to be possible for us to actually do that policy. And then the existential part is to show that like you could show that there are 99 ways that we could reduce our arms sales that would be terrible ideas. But as long as the affirmative proves that there's one that's a good idea, they win the round, right? The negative can't just bring up, examples of ways we could do it. This is called counter warrants to go back into the theory archive. But so the reason is because it's an existential statement. But this has to do with the structure of affirmative and negative. So it's a very common misconception in policy that negative means you have to prove the opposite of the resolution. You have to prove it false. You do not have to prove the resolution false as a negative. In fact, it's almost impossible to do so when the resolution is an existential statement. Because if anyone who's taken a logic course knows, the negation of an existential statement is a universal negative statement, i.e., all the possible ways we could do this thing are wrong, which is a really hard burden to do, sometimes impossible, right? So Karl Popper has a funny example. He's like, there exists an oyster 5 times as large as the next largest oyster. Like, we all know that's false, right? You run out of oysters, but you can never prove it false because you have to keep looking.
Yeah, this is like the whatever, like the apple pie in the sky or something like.
Yeah. And so negative is really important here because to negate something just means deny the truth of. You don't need to prove it false. But that's not what we have in PF. We have pros and cons. And that's a massive difference because the pros and cons of an issue already assumes that something has happened or will happen. And we are just debating whether the benefits outweigh the cost. And so that's why the two structures of PF resolutions are the US should do X or the benefits of X outweigh the costs of X. Those are both ways of putting, like, what are the pros and cons of a certain thing, a certain action.
Interesting. I have two questions. One, this is a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. And then two, I think we're going to go down the route that you have set up for us and really interrogate it. The first one is the tangent. Given that affirming the resolution and like policy is an existential statement, and all the AF needs to do to prove that the statement is true is to prove that there is a version that you could and should do.
Yeah, you could read conditional plans.
Let's go.
I think you probably read conditional plans, but that's pretty controversial.
Yeah, I've heard as much. I mean, I think like I'm roommates with Amadea. She shares the same view, which makes
yeah. We agree on this, but there's a version of this is not exactly what prevails in policy. The way in which they relate to the resolution is a little different, which is far too much of a rabbit hole for here.
Okay.
But I've just given enough of a rabbit hole.
Okay, very cool though. I think it's an interesting take. Okay, number two, let's go down this road that you've set up for us. So, given that PF resolutions are about the pros and the cons of something that happens or whatever, It's not an existential statement. How does this change the burdens of the pro and the con side?
Yeah, so I think this totally changes the burdens. Let's take an easy answer, easy area to understand why it's different, which is presumption. So the burden of presumption in policy is supposed to say that presumption is against the affirmative because that's a change from the status quo. But in PF, it's not assumed that the affirmative is a change from the status quo, right? In PF, it really just depends on the structure of the resolution. And so I think that if it's a resolution that has some change from the status quo, whoever is defending the least change from the status quo, be it the pro and the con, like an area in which the pro might be defending the least change from the status quo is like the US should not, right? Or something like that.
Right. Or for example, there have been topics semi-recently like um, the benefits of social media for democracy outweigh the harms. And then
Right.
like, yeah,
Yeah, so this one, there's no clear action involved.
right,
And so I
right.
think for these ones, the judge should just flip a coin. If the debate comes down to presumption, the judge should just flip a coin. Like there's no, I don't think there's a better way to definitively resolve it because there's no, the burdens are symmetrical, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
I'm giving the benefits, the cons, and if the benefits are 100, the cons are 100, flip a coin. Like you
Yeah,
have to decide the
yeah.
debate.
That makes sense. There's like an equivalent of this in like Parley and in like world schools, which is like they call them I think analysis motions versus like action motions, which makes sense. It's probably the same thing in PF. We just for some reason haven't really categorized them.
I think CETA had when they were still doing their own motions, and I think Parley has this as well. They have a lot of scholarship on the different kinds of
Yeah.
resolutions. That's really interesting and underexplored.
Yeah, worth looking
Um,
into for sure.
yeah, but the thing that I think is important is the critique, right? So the critique in policy uh, functions on two levels. So one way in which the critique can function is to say that we should be thinking about the debate round as something more than just the affirmation of the resolutional statement. And so there are different burdens that the affirmative has to be to really productive view. But that's one level it operates. The other way it operates is it could operate to disprove the resolutional statement. So an example of something that does this is the reps critique, the representations critique. So the representations critique in policy says, first, I'm going to expand the range of things that we can show that the AF is a bad idea for. So I'm going to go from just the direct policy impacts to how the policy is framed is also a thing that matters.
Right.
Then I'm going to have some offense based on that and probably some advocacy that captures the affirmative while avoiding those downsides.
Right,
And
right.
so the reps critique disproves the resolutional statement
I,
because
I
they have,
I have a question about that.
yeah.
Linguistically, like how? Like we said that the existential statement of the resolution is like a could and a would or a should, right?
Okay,
Like,
so ignore all the stuff about the existential statement stuff
okay,
because that's not how policy debate currently functions. Like they're right that it's an existential statement, but what happens in policy is you have the resolution, and the resolution is not actually the statement that it gets debated. It is a
right,
field from which you pluck a plan that is an example of the resolution, but just by coincidence almost. Like it has to be an example of the resolution, but you under no circumstances are actually debating the resolution. Okay? That's very important. So then you have the plan that you're stuck with. And so even if the thing about the reps, like all these picks, like the reps case, right? Their advocacy is going to be topical. It's going to be a version of the plan minus the framing, which is still proves the resolution true. But
right.
because we're not actually debating the resolution, the negative still wins that debate. Um,
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, wait. So, okay,
I have an article about this, but
yeah, this is really
yeah,
cool. So then, I mean, you can keep cooking, but I just want to take a breather here to
yeah. Sorry, that was pretty dense.
No, no, this is great. This is exactly what I want. I think maybe that there's two conclusions here for how this applies to PF, at least two for me right now. Maybe we'll get into
Yeah,
more. One, it seems like one of the reasons that policy critiques negate is because we are debating a plan and policy instead of the existential statement of the resolution. Um,
that's correct for topical alternatives. So specifically, reps critiques I don't think other critiques it matters
Okay,
as much.
well, at
Um,
least for those kinds of critiques with topical
yeah,
alternatives, the
yeah,
rep critiques,
correct.
this you have to appeal to something else to justify them in PF. They are not,
Yeah,
and maybe there is nothing else. Like maybe linguistically, they literally don't. They don't.
yeah. So I'll expand a little bit. I think most critiques just do not function in PF, like because because of the structure of the round, you are giving the pros and cons of something that's already been presupposed. And so
Right.
because you're not negating that statement, anything that's not directly connected to that action or the costs and benefits of something is not a con of that thing. So
Right.
it is not predictable, it's not admissible in that way.
Yeah, so that's the second thing I was going to say. The first thing is like there's something about plans specifically that gives ground to certain types of critiques. Given that PF does not have plans, those critiques do not have ground. And then number two is that maybe all of the other critiques also don't have ground because of this business with pro and con, the business with it being a different kind of statement in the resolution.
Yeah, I think that's true. So what I was going to lay out was that I think that because of the pro and con structure, um, it's very different, right? And it's because burdens don't exist
Mhm.
in PF, right? Burdens don't exist in the same way as policy, at least, right? The burden of the affirmative is to introduce a plan and just show the plan is true, right? In modern policy.
Yeah.
Um, but that doesn't exist in PF. And so when your burden is to show the cons of presumably the resolutional statement, which is the only predictable statement that you would be giving cons to, um, your critiques just like don't do anything. Like there's nothing to negate, uh, or there's nothing to affirm, right?
Right.
Critically, because your burden has been predictably given. Now, I think this impacts the sort of topicality framework stuff with critical affirmatives, because I think critical affirmatives actually also stem from this move to plans and policy.
Right. I
Because,
agree. Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, the way it worked was that if you are debating the resolution, there's no room for critical affirmatives insofar as they don't affirm the resolution. But as soon as you make this move to the affirmative is reading a plan that falls within some field dictated by the resolution, the
Mhm.
bounds of that field are don't it doesn't make sense anymore why the bounds of that field also happen to be the resolution, right? You can widen that field to non-conventional readings of the resolution and responses to it that open the door for critical affirmatives. And that just doesn't exist in PF.
Right. So the only subset of critiques that are in policy that could be like transposed into PF are those that intentionally deny their topicality and then just debate whether or not they require like a link to the topic in the first place, which is something that you probably say like you do require logically because of the linguistics of what it means to affirm.
Yeah, so I think critical arguments that are a pro or a con of a topic are legitimate, right? And I
Mhm.
think that you can manipulate the meaning of the topic to try and make these critical arguments happen. But as long as you can make an argument that that's, the predictable model of debate, I find it hard to conceive of legitimate critical argumentation outside of those bounds.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And a lot of this stems from your use of like pro and con. I want to point out one thing for the audience, because some people might be watching this and they might be puzzled because these days PF actually uses the words af and neg more than pro and con, which is puzzling. But I think this goes back to the three like sources of debate norms that you mentioned at the start. Like the NSDA rules and the tournament invite for public forum debate will always say pro and con. Like, it's true that debate norms are ever evolving, and the current iteration of debate norms for PF has stolen words from policy and LD that actually do not apply to PF, which is a sort of a trend. And then sort of now those are all the rage. Those are the popular terms. I think often because people want to either people come in from policy and LD, they are used to using these terms, or people want to appeal to like sounding like they're more technical by appealing to the verbiage of policy and LD. But in fact, in this case, like it literally does not apply. These are not words that are like these are affirm and negate are terms of art in debate, in policy debate. And the art that they are terms of is not public forum.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Like, I think another example of this is that this pro and con structure really presupposes a lot about like consequences, I would argue, or maybe not, because you could argue, let's say a con of this topic is that it violates the categorical imperative, right?
Right.
That could be a con. I think that's probably fine, but there's some like level of weighing inherent to this that it just doesn't exist with affirmative and negative.
Yeah,
I would argue.
that makes sense.
Like
Uh,
for let me give an example. So like an argument in an LD debate is like trivialism, which just says all propositions are true. The resolution is a proposition. Our burden is to prove the resolution true. We win the debate because everything's true.
yeah,
Okay.
proof by explosion.
Yeah, something like that. That could be a way to trigger trivialism. But this just doesn't apply to PF, right? Because your burden is not to show the resolution true or false, right? It's to provide pros and cons of the resolution for the judge to weigh
Yeah.
and decide, do the pros outweigh the cons, right? That's what they do.
That's so interesting. So like truth testing frameworks that you see in LD probably don't operate the same way in
No,
PF.
no, because of the constitutive roles given by affirmative and negative. Like, I think this is a massive deal. I don't know if anyone else thinks it's a massive deal. I think this is a massive deal.
Okay, I think there's
But yeah,
one more thing we need to do to justify why it's a massive deal. And that is to beat the argument that like who cares? Like we should just debate in the way that is most educational or most fair. Like
okay, so here's my argument, and I think that, and this is going to come up when we talk about topicality and normal means, but I'll just make it here, which is that predictability is the only thing that matters, like lexically, in the sense that like it's going to be the thing that controls everything else. So what do I mean by this? Which is that when you weigh something like limits or ground, which hopefully PFers are exposed to, at least the latter, right?
yeah, yeah, a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, what matters is not, in a vacuum, how many things are enabled by some interpretation or how good the arguments are against a certain thing, but how predictable those limits are, right? Because the thing about ground, for example, so ground is how can I respond to this thing, right? How can I respond in this model of debate that you create? Um, is that it only matters if it's predictable, right? Debaters are always going to come up with arguments against arguments that other debaters make, but only if they can predict them in advance, right? If I'm making some crazy arguments that don't engage with the resolution or anything at all, right, then my ground is going to be terrible, even if theoretically I could have made some great arguments against it. And the same goes for limits, right? If there are, 25 different affirmative arguments that could be made, but I can prepare for all of them, that's chill. And that might be even more chill than their interpretation has 10 arguments. Oh, it's much more limited, but it's completely unpredictable before the debate round. And so this aspect of predictability is really important. The second argument you would need for this is that the best way we have for predicting debate norms has to come before debate norms as they're practiced in the community, because those norms are inaccessible to debaters who have not debated before, right? Who don't have that information about the community, and the norms the community has developed are like secondary and derivative of the rules set out for the activity in the first place
Yeah, it's like
that
an
are authoritative.
arbitrary like abstraction from the original rules that has just for some reason been decided upon by consensus or by near consensus.
But that's the thing, is it's not necessarily even consensus, because if it was consensus, if there was some contract that we were like, we all are going to shake hands and agree to like debate affirmative and negative style and like ignore pro and con, that would be one thing, but that's just not the case. And so it's not predictable. And so it's hard to claim any comparative benefits from model of debate that neglects these sort of constitutive roles given to you by the rules of your activity.
Yeah, 100%. That's so interesting. Um, there's one last thing I want to do, and then I want to get into examples of this and how it applies to Ks and PF. The last thing is a complete tangent, and it's just
Sure.
for my own, it's just to humor me, really. There is a section, I did this with Bennett yesterday. Let me see, I want to see your take on this. I'm going to show you um, I'm going to show you a section of the PF and SDA rules.
NSDA handbook, you mean?
Yeah.
The unified manual?
Of course, the
I've
one
read
that
I've read these more than I'd like to admit.
wonderful. So it's this paragraph
Oh
specifically.
yes, yes, yeah. This is total. This is one of the worst written. NFALD has a worse one. If you've ever read NFALD's rules, like they're completely incoherent. But yeah. So I've heard who was it? Was it Larry or Nails? Some LDer was reading this and was just like the formalized comprehensive proposal for the reasoning to support a position of advocacy just includes plans.
Yeah, yeah, this
Um,
part, the generalized practical solutions, like all of this.
Yeah, so I think this reflects a failure of imagination, uh, in the sense that there were people in and like NDT debate, and even I think ADA, which is like a policy leaning college thing, has written in like banning critiques or something, and it just doesn't work. Like it just doesn't work. And so I think what matters is setting up your activity in such a way that logically plans and counterplans are prohibited.
Right.
Because the thing about a truth testing model of debate is that it logically explains why you can have a plan and a counterplan, right? You get plans because they prove the resolution true, right? If I prove a state, yeah, obviously. You get counterplans because they're opportunity costs that disprove the plan. And so by disproving the plan, you negate the resolution because you stop the affirmative from being able to prove the resolution true. Now, I think this whole section is actually irrelevant if my argument about pros and cons is valid, because offering the pros and cons of something, as long as that thing is the resolution, means there's no plans to offer because a
Right.
plan is not a pro, right?
Okay.
Neither is a con.
This is really weird because I was thinking the same thing. I
You
completely
can maybe argue for counterplans, but I think negative fiat is illegitimate.
Okay, that's
And
interesting.
here's why. Actually,
Okay, yeah.
pros and cons shows why negative fiat is, or presupposes the illegitimacy of negative fiat, and here's why. So I think that when we're thinking of a con, right? What's a con of something? So a con, if you were to explain how a counterplan could fit in, would be here is something that you are giving up by doing the plan. So you would say a con of doing nuclear energy is that you are giving up the opportunity to invest in wind power instead, right? I think that might be an argument that people make. But is it? Is the question is what is the resolution relative to, right? And I think the structure of PF implies that the resolution is relative to the status quo, right? What are the pros and cons of this policy as opposed to what we're doing now? And maybe you can make an argument it's not. And this goes back to a debate in philosophy over actualism versus possibilism. So
Mhm.
actualism versus possibilism says when you're deciding whether or not you should do something, what are you comparing that thing to? So there's two possibilities. One is what you could do, and one is what you're actually going to do. So the
Mhm.
example is Professor Procrastinate has been asked to write a book review, and he's the best guy for the job. However, he's also a serial procrastinator. And so if he says yes and writes the book, that's the best option. If he says yes and doesn't write the book, that's the worst option because then they're left waiting on the review. And if he says no, they'll find another reviewer who's slightly less good. So that'll be like the second best scenario. And so the question is, should he agree to write the book? So actualism says yes, says no, because he knows if he agrees, he's not
Right.
going to write the book. Possibilism says yes, because it says to get to that best option, it's necessary that he agrees to write the book, right? To get to agree and write, he has to agree.
That makes sense.
And
So
so this is a philosophical debate.
right. So you're saying that the pro con structure of PF is actualist, implies actualism.
I think it might be, because when I'm thinking about a con, right, I'm thinking about like what are the downsides to a proposal. But I
Right.
think you might have to do the extra work. I think you have to do the extra work to say relative to what, right?
Right.
Relative to what? The
Right.
actualist take is that the resolution is relative to the status quo, because that's actually what the US would do instead, is nothing, right? Instead of the resolution. But the possibilist could bring in the counterplan.
Here's a counter example I came up with just now. Um,
Yeah.
I am a person applying to law school. Let's say I've gotten into multiple law schools, and
Okay.
this is a PF resolution. It's resolved. Mac should accept the offer to Duke Law School.
Sure.
Um, Under your actualist model of pro and con, you would say this is relative to the status quo of not accepting any offer to any law school.
It's relative to whatever you would actually do instead.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's not
Okay, okay,
it's
okay.
not presupposing that's the status quo,
Right,
but in the
right.
case of the PF topic, it's probably the status quo.
That makes
You would
sense.
have,
So
yeah.
So the con can say, like, obviously you should do a different law school, but they can't say which one. Like, they have to say the most likely thing that Mac will do if he
Yes.
doesn't accept
Yes,
it. Yeah.
exactly. And
Okay.
so this it's the status quo counterplan, as it's been
Right,
called
right,
in the
right, right, right,
literature.
right. That makes a ton of sense. I
So
agree.
this is why it's no negative fiat, but not no negative counterplans, because you can use the counterplan as a framing argument.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. It's just like what is the most likely path that will happen in the absence of doing the resolution? Cool. And this is interesting too. I've talked about this in a lecture on this channel. This kind of implies not like negative fiat, but negative fiat. Like, bear with me. Like cancellation, for example. Like, for example, if the status quo is that I'm totally going to accept an offer to Duke Law School, then the negative is actually not the status quo. The negative is that like you canceled the current plan to do this and so you result in something else. It's actually sort of a departure from the trend that the status quo is going down. Um,
Yeah.
Interesting. Does that change
Yeah.
the assumption?
Does that change presumption? Uh,
Like if I make the argument that this is like, for example, the U.S.
okay, a presumption is actually the most confusing argument in debate and probably fake. Like, genuinely, that is the only conclusion that I've really come to. Like, I've seen, I think Zarefsky, like models of debate, like about like hypothesis testing, have a good story about presumption because of the way of modeling resolution. But I think that way is wrong, and so it's just very confusing. But also, your debate should not be coming down to a tie. Like, like,
Yeah.
like I something must have gone horribly wrong for the debate to come down to presumption. So that's my real takeaway from reading way too much about it.
Facts. Facts. Last thing I wanted to say here. I completely agree with everything you said since I've pulled up this slide. Problem is, I think they made an oopsie here. Because like I think you're right. Like the logical structure of pro and con for public forum seems to render this like sort of irrelevant. This is redundant, right? But
Yeah, I actually think so the problem is that reasoning to support a position of advocacy is a plan or a counterplan.
yeah,
That's what they are.
exactly, exactly. So
Yeah.
like
So
they overcooked is what happened here. Like in the name of trying to ban plans and counterplans, which they didn't need to do because the pro and con structure of PF already does that. They accidentally like
yes, the
explicitly allowed.
position of advocacy wording specifically is very problematic because it
Yeah,
implies that they are defending an advocacy.
right,
And
right.
defending an advocacy is a term of art used to refer to a plan or a counterplan. And so I think it makes much more sense that PFers are not defending advocacies, right? PFers are offering pros and cons of a resolution. And yeah, this should just be a get this out of here. Like,
So,
get this out of here.
but the problem is like as it stands, without the NSDA getting this out of here, uh, under your interpretation of how debate ought operate or how it does operate, in fact, you would say that like PFers, it is totally legitimate for PFers to do this because the
Do what? Do
like
what?
offer a generalized practical solution in the form of an advocacy on the pro or the con, which in reality should.
So yeah, probably because I think you have the schmagency problem. So give a little elaboration. I'm going to introduce my splan. My splan says the United States ought to fund nuclear energy at X dollar amount. Right, that's my splan. And it's reasoning to support a position of advocacy that the United States ought to do invest more in domestic nuclear energy. Um, yeah, I don't think you could get around this. Uh,
Damn, that's crazy. To be clear, like you should it would be bad for
my
public forum.
Splauner plan.
Yeah, it would be bad for public forums if people start coming up and reading splans all over the place. Unfortunately,
Redact this. Redact this.
yeah, right. Unfortunately, it's allowed. Like the recourse we need to like we need to amass enough of a like a critical mass of people who are concerned about this to get them to change the rules, and then we're good. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
okay. The last
Did Bennett come up with this? No, maybe he's an LDR, right?
Yeah, he did not come up with the Splan. I guess he had like similar conclusions to you. Not as much in depth on the pro and con stuff, but yeah, basically our conclusion was like, yes, unfortunately, this does allow for
Yeah,
planned.
probably.
Okay, the last thing with all of this pro and con stuff, and then maybe
Yeah,
we'll get into some nuclear energy discussion.
sure.
I think a lot of this has been pretty abstract so far. Not a
Yeah,
problem. Let's try to ground it in some examples. So maybe
sure,
one good way to do this is like let's take like the set call K on nuclear
sure,
energy. This
sure.
should be
Yeah, this is probably the critique I coach most often in
oh,
LDR
wonderful,
policy.
wonderful. Then I guess I'll have you do two things. One, can you set it up for us? Like walk me through what you think a set call K would look like on the nuclear energy topic. And then two, I want you to explain in detail why, like how you would respond to it on the other side, in the framework level when you're in PF specifically and talking about pro and con.
Okay, so it's tricky because there are a couple different ways to run set call, but I think that most of them just wouldn't work in in so let's talk about if this was a policy topic, right?
Yeah.
Let's say this topic's in policy. So the first thing to think about with framework, actually, can I get some water real quick? And then I will
No. Yeah, yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Okay, we're on set call.
Okay. So let's take a step back and think about how framework operates in the debate. So framework as a policy or like a Douglas argument or even maybe PF argument, there's three different ways in which the word framework is used, which makes things very confusing. So I'm going to say what framework is not here. So framework is not a mechanism of evaluating a should or ought statement, i.e. utilitarianism, libertarianism, Kant, whatever. It's not that. Another thing framework is not is a topicality argument regarding what the affirmative has the burden to defend in a round, right? You have to defend the resolution, whatever. Not talking about that. Framework I'm talking about here is thinking about win conditions for the affirmative, right? What does the affirmative have to do, or the pro, I guess, in this round, to win the debate? So the most common argument, and framework also does a whole bunch of other stuff for critiques on the negative. So let's think about the most there. It's kind of like on a spectrum of just like how towards which side does the framework favor. So starting with like the most /pro version of the framework is something called plan focus, right? Which just says you have to prove that the plan is a bad idea through links to what the plan does, right? So this is actually two separate things. One, it says, here's our burden, which is to show the plan's a good idea. And two, it says, what are you allowed to pick from to disprove the burden, right? So that's plan focus. Now, you would never read this on the negative with any critique, because the whole premise of the critique is that it has a different framework argument. So one step back from this is something like the reps K that I talked about earlier. So the reps K says, sure, your burden is to prove the res true. We agree, right? You can weigh your plan. We don't care. But we want links to things that are not just what exactly the plan does, but also how you've described the plan. Right? So
Mhm.
this is kind of more of a middle ground because you're letting them weigh the justifications they have for their plan. Now, in practice, you don't actually let them weigh that because you read a PIC, plan inclusive critique, that says, we're going to do the whole plan, but minus that problematic stuff you said. And so we're going to solve everything you solved materially. So it's also, even that sort of middle ground can be problematic. And so, but I think that you can deal with this by saying, wait, you agree our burden is to show the resolution is true. And your statement, even if it doesn't include our discourse, still proves the resolution true. So you don't negate. Uh, and so then we go even further to say, actually, it's not about the resolution, right? Before you try and prove the resolution true, you have to show that, for example, the reading of the constructive was justified in the first place. And there might be a couple arguments for this, right? There might be a logical argument, right? You have to explain why you took an action in the first place before you look at the action itself, right? Or, debate should be educational first and foremost, debate should be ethical first and foremost, right? All these other arguments about why your critique should come first. And so these type of arguments, a problem is that a lot of them are really dependent on the side structure, right?
Mhm.
There are burdens that a side has to meet that in a sort of symmetrical structure like PF, where either side can speak first or last, don't make as much sense. And so it would be really tough to make a framework argument. Another thing that framework can do is it can establish competition for an alternative, or an alternative, like on the negative. And so this is super relevant with like the capitalism critique. Now, anyone familiar with the capitalism critique a little bit has wondered at some point, doesn't this just lose to the permutation every single time? I say double bind. Look, we have there, the alternative is so big that it overcomes the links, or it's not big enough to shoot down the US government, right? Uh, and everyone has wondered this. Many are still wondering this. And the answer is framework, right? You make a framework argument about why the standard for competition should not just be simple opportunity costs, but should involve thinking about the ideologies underpinning policies and really refining those. And so debate is a place to test strategy and tactics about ideology. And so we should be sort of bracketing out that competition stuff so we can artificially, test our ideology better. But again, if you can't introduce counterplans, I certainly don't understand how you're introducing alternatives, because your
Yeah.
burden is not to disprove the resolution. It's to show cons to the resolution that the judge weighs. And so all of the issues with like negative fiat apply doubly, where it's just like, not only is it unclear if we can do the capitalism K alternative, but it's also definitely not what we would do instead if we just didn't do the resolution.
Right.
So I think to go back to your original question, so generally Set Col is kind of flexible, right? So this is why I think it's very strategic in other events, is because you can read it as very framework heavy, right? With a push on that, usually focusing on psychoanalysis. And then if that doesn't work out, you can be very cheaty with a big alternative that like uh, changes the world. And so there's multiple layers at which you can go for it. Now, I think the negative fiat stuff is troubling for the alternative, right? Uh, and so how I would go for it is honestly more of a framing argument, closer to the Kant stuff that I was talking about earlier, which is you have a link argument about how additional investment in nuclear energy is particularly problematic. And in fact, you can prey on the pros framing that, because what the pros going to have to do in this topic is they're going to have to differentiate additional spending from the spending of the status quo. They're
Right.
going to be making arguments about how, there's a brink, or there's like a critical mass of spending we need, or something to garner any advantage. And so every single point they make about that is a argument for why your link is unique, right? Why status quo nuclear colonialism could get much, much worse in the world of the plan, right? Uh, and pair that with an argument about framing why the ethics of colonialism should come first, right? Where it's just like, as a judge, this con outweighs any of their pros, right? Because this is something you are ethically complicit in, and you should prioritize. And so you can make arguments about why you should err towards the con based on how people are ethically invested in structures of colonialism. And you can make similar arguments for why they should distrust the pros arguments, right? Is like their defense mechanisms or whatever. So this is a way to go for the critique without framework proper in a way that I think coheres with everything else in PF.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My question for you now is, I think this is maybe a question on the mind of a lot of the people in the audience. Like, if I'm imagining a PFer watching this, they're probably like, this is great. I have all of these great thoughts about how I can beat these critiques that don't actually apply in public forum, but I don't actually know how. Like, what am I going to actually do? Like, I think it's difficult maybe for people to imagine standing up in a PF speech and like making the arguments that you just made in the form of a speech against a critique. But let's pretend
Yeah.
like inevitably on this topic, like at the TOC, some team on the con is going to stand up and read a Set Col critique that is just straight up ripped from the policy wiki with no changes that adapted to PF. What do you do if you're on the other side? Like, how do you phrase this in such a way that the judge will actually vote for you? Especially since a lot of judges don't understand any of this and are sort of set in their ways.
Yeah. So I think this really does depend on the judge, right? And it depends on the judge at the level of form, but not content. And I think this is extremely important because when you're thinking about how do I package an argument, it's the actual argument you're going to be making is going to be the same regardless of the judge for the most part. Judges are chill with good arguments, but you got to put it in a way that makes sense. So really look at their paradigm. See, are they coming from policy? Are they coming from PF? Are they a parrot? And that's the first step, right? And so I don't know who your judge is going to be, but think about translating the substance into whoever you're giving it to. So the first step to answering any critique is making a framework argument. So I think there's two kinds of critiques generally that you're going to be answering in PF. There's going to be the parley style critiques that are completely unrelated to the resolution and just are trying to get the ballot on the basis of some theory about debate, right? And this is completely different from answering a more substantive critique because the arguments you're going to be making are different. And they're going to differ by side too. Like, I think this is something you're going to deal with on the pro or con. I don't know if I want to go into that here, but I'll just bracket that for now. But in terms of answering the Set Col critique more generally, I think the first thing you start with is a framework argument. So you want to say, what is our role in the debate? So say you're on the pro, right? Our role with the pro, right, is to show that the benefits outweigh the cons. If we do that, we win, right? And give some reasons why this is the most predictable model of debate, right? It's in the rules, this is what pros and cons are about. And that sort of the resolution, right? It's right there. The word resolved indicates we're probably going to debate that. And so all of these are reasons why this is a predictable model of debate. And predictability is important for the reasons I told you earlier about limits and ground. Now, there's two arguments that people go for in policy with framework. There is fairness, right? Which is sort of an intrinsic impact, which is that their model of debate is unfair. Now, most people are really mixed on this. The metagame has come and gone. There's a lot of different policy tricks people can go through on fairness. Go like a Michigan. I'm not here for fairness. I think clash is usually the more strategic impact because it's a lot easier for debaters to articulate why it's a good idea, and it generally interacts very favorably with con critique arguments. So what do I mean by this? When you say clash, you mean that when we are both prepared to debate the same model of debate, and we can come together and have a really good debate in depth about that topic, that is going to change us in the sense that we are able to engage at a higher level than if you're coming with this very unpredictable stuff that we didn't agree to talk about. And that depth of engagement is really important for examining a topic very thoroughly, because that's what you're preparing about multiple levels on both sides. You're deconstructing your assumptions about the topic, and you're also developing better argumentative skills. And so the reason why this is such a good impact is it's not just that it's good to have these argumentative skills, but because those skills and that reflexivity that you get from examining both sides of a topic are going to be key to resolving whatever impacts the neg framework is talking about. The neg framework says, right, debaters are complicit in settler colonialism. The best way to examine a bias like that is to develop the skills for reflexivity. The best way to combat like settler political projects is to get the argumentative skills to go out there and advocate, right? So it's going to be very favorable.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's pretty stock. But
yeah, four things to say about this. One is shit. I always do this. I always have like a whole list of things, and then I got to make sure I actually have enough. Okay, I have two rhetorical tricks at the very least to add to this that I was thinking about while you were discussing this. Number one is I think you could at the very top of your like framework argument, you should literally just say like make fun of them a little bit. Like they clearly ripped this off of the policy wiki, or they like took this from LD and they pretended that it applies in PF. It does not apply in PF, even if you think it applies in other events. Our framework argument is unique to PF. And I think even just saying that goes very far. The second rhetorical trick you can do to sell this is I think what you should do is pretend that they have a burden in their framework, which probably they actually do. Like explain why they are missing a part of their framework by saying like they need to offer you an interpretation of what the burdens of the pro and the con are specific to PF, and they didn't. Like they don't have any concept of what the con's role is in the debate that coheres with the framework arguments that they're offering you on their side. And even like this doesn't actually mean all that much. Like it's sort of redundant with the argument you're already making, but it's a rhetorical trick that I think works, that's persuasive for a lot of technical judges. The third thing I was going to say is the nice thing about this framework argument specifically is you have a lot of the stock pieces as well. Like a lot of the things you started talking about at the end, they seem somewhat familiar to framework debates. And so this is kind of nice. It's a little bit baity. Like the other side is going to treat this like a normal framework debate, and they'll answer some of your standards and stuff. And then you'll be like, no, like my framework argument is not what you were expecting. You completely missed the like PF specific predictability stuff, which like magnifies all of these and gets around some of your responses. I think that's how you should treat it in the debate. Like point it out when they make a mistake and they misinterpret your framework argument. And then the fourth thing I wanted to do is ask you a question. But if you have something to say before that.
Yeah, I just wanted something to add to that is that, yeah, there's two parts to this. One is that the sort of impact stuff I described is going to be pretty standard if you've done framework debating in any event. And it's because that stuff comes from what people consider to be the most predictable model of debate, right? The most predictable model of debate is going to be the most fair and promote the best clash. Simple as that. And so the unique argument here is saying that what does that predictable model of debate look like in PF, and why does it look like that in PF? And that's referring to the sort of definitions of constitutive things in the activities, like the rules.
That makes 100% sense. The last question that I was going to ask is, you said that this depends a lot on the judge. If you have a policy judge specifically, I know that doesn't really mean anything. It's not really a monolith. But if you have like, I don't know, like a policy judge that is a normal, like in the middle, average policy judge who will vote for K's in policy, how do you word this argument to like nod to them and be like, look, man, like this clearly doesn't apply in PF?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the rhetorical stuff you talked about would actually be very effective. And I think some language that to go along with that is it's just like the rules of the activity are different, the norms of the activity are different, which means what constitutes a predictable model, you should reframe what you think about as the predictable models of debate and the norms of this activity, right? Is like, because I know you probably haven't judged too much PF. And I think something is that policy judges are biased against PF, and that they think that like for in a lot of ways, but part of it is just like you have to kind of level with them and be like, we're not trying to exclude the K because we are afraid of it, right? We are making a technical argument about the sort of predictable norms of the activity, right? And I think that'll be pretty clear with the sort of language that you're using, but that sort of appearance is really important because policy judges do not want to see PFers hand wave away
Right.
arguments that policy judges think should be taken seriously.
Yeah. And another way you can do this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but like if you think this judge is like a K hack, you can say like, look, I wish PF allowed for Ks, but it doesn't. Like it's not my fault. I'm not saying like we shouldn't debate
Well,
Ks.
oh wait, something that's I think there's kind of a topical version of the K
Mhm.
that I think is really doing a lot of work where it's just like they could have read
Oh yeah, yeah,
arguments
yeah, yeah.
about the res that cause nuclear colonialism that solves their education impacts because they can still talk about all of these problems and negate the res, but they chose not to, right?
Right,
And
right.
that I think is a killer when you're answering their arguments on framework.
Yeah, this is like if anyone in the audience knows like the TVAs, like the topical version of the affirmative as a response to like a non-T KF. This is the equivalent just against like any K
And
in
I think it actually just works in PF, like straight up, like I because of the structure, like
yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think it also like it performs a double function where it allows you to even better rhetorically sell it to the judge. Like my position is not that extreme. I'm not saying like ban all discourse. Like first of all, it's not
yeah,
even my
no,
fault.
seriously.
Like this is baked into the rules. Like sorry. I'm just the one who's explaining why it doesn't apply. And two, it's not like this position is too radical either. Like it's kind of okay. We're still allowing them a million different paths into the same discourse, maybe even better discourse.
Right. It's actually, it proves your argument about why nuanced clash is better because
Right.
you're prepared to debate nuclear colonialism and you should be on this topic, right?
Yeah, 100%. Okay, this is good stuff. I think it's also transitioning us nicely into talking about nuclear energy specifically. I guess now I'll like formally begin the nuclear topic discussion. I know that you already know this, but just one more time, the wording of the resolution for April for PF is
I
resolved.
have it. I have it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But
okay.
yeah, you should say it. You should
Yeah,
say it.
US federal government should substantially increase its investments in domestic nuclear energy. I believe is the wording. Do I have that
Yeah.
right? Let's go.
Yeah.
First thoughts on this topic.
Wholly normal means. So the the single biggest like chunk of time consistently you'll see in every single debate will be the definitions debate. Period.
Interesting.
Um, I
Why?
may okay, maybe not. But if I would want to know what does domestic mean and what does substantially mean.
Mhm.
Uh, Probably the other way around. But like to me, so the best nuclear AF that has ever been, it's always the SMR SAF. It's always the small modular reactors every single time, every single college policy topic. Um, like that this is kind of a tangent, but the thing about that is that like some of the best impacts are about military usage abroad. The
Mhm.
question is that domestic? You're
Right.
building the reactors here. And so that's like probably where the domestic one might come up, but I think substantially is more important, right? Because nuclear power is expensive, right? How much are we investing? How different is that going to be from the status quo? How much of a difference is that going to make? It's going to be a huge deal. And I think that this is where like the plan stuff comes in, where it's just
Mhm.
like, plan solve this.
Right.
But it's I don't it doesn't make sense actually because think about it this way. With the pro and con structure, you shouldn't be really advocating a counterplan directly. It could be like, plan, we should substantially increase domestic energy in small modular reactor production. And then the con says, here are some cons for investing in something else. And
Yeah.
then it's like, it doesn't make any sense. I think that's a very good argument against plans, right? In the sense
Yeah,
where it's
that's
just like,
true.
it makes a lot more sense if there's a definitions debate and
Right.
then whoever wins the definitions debate controls the sort of magnitude of the links.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I want to push back on that a tiny bit. I think that from a little bit of experience in PF, it seems like the more common thing that does the same function, performs the same function as the definition debate, is not necessarily like a topicality stuff. It's not like what does the word substantial
sure.
mean? but rather what is it likely to look like? Like, I guess the way that I
Yeah,
think,
that's a normal means argument. That's a normal means
right,
argument.
yeah, yeah. So
Um,
they're both normal means arguments. One is just like I guess the way I think about it is like the definition is a whole like bubble
yeah,
of things. Yeah.
yeah. No, that makes sense because it's just like yeah. So I had stuff written down, and I was thinking about how you debate this actually, because I think this is going to be a common debate. And so I have like topicality slash normal means. I was like, it's sort of both. And so I was just like, this is normally so traditionally in policy, this is the burden of the affirmative, but that's because of the structure of the resolution. So in PF, it's obviously different. The burdens are symmetrical, speech order is different, and so neither side has a priority for their definitions, right? So how do we adjudicate these debates? And so I would like to give an argument for accuracy being the best test of topicality, right? So accuracy as opposed to what, right? So the reason why I think accuracy is important is because the most accurate definition is often going to be the most predictable definition.
Mhm.
And predictability is good for all the reasons that I've said previously in this sort of interview. But what are the alternatives, right? I think the alternatives to accuracy largely relate to what's called debatability. So how good the debates are
Mhm.
under those definitions. But I think debatability is a bit of a chimera because the model that you're discussing that we should have debates over doesn't really happen outside of this debate if you
Mhm.
win. Whereas the most accurate definition is going to be structuring what people are going in to every debate with, presumably, or at least most debates. So
Right.
I think that accuracy is probably the best way to approach this. So thinking
And
about like, oh yeah, go for it.
to be clear, accuracy is both for the definition of the words and also their likely like form or
Yeah, so I think accuracy takes both into account, where it's just like, what does the word mean in the context of the resolution and thinking about domestic energy policy, right? And so it's like when you're interpreting a statute as a judge, right? The first place you look is you look at the words and you look to see if any of them are ambiguous. If they're unambiguous, like United States federal government, it's like, okay, we can move on. But if they're ambiguous, like substantially, then you start looking to other sources to understand what that word means. And so I think, yeah, you got to look at the whole phrase. You got to look at, what are we doing in domestic energy policy? What is substantially meant in the context of federal investment, right? These are all different sources to look to for the accuracy of a word. Um, I think it's vague enough that I don't think there's going to be any one definition that's most accurate, but I think that there are going to be enough definitions with relatively comparable accuracy
Mhm.
that you can use the other stuff as kind of a tiebreaker.
Yeah.
That's I think how we'll hopefully see debates play out.
And to be clear about the other stuff, like
Yeah. So like debatability. So I think debatability to a certain extent informs accuracy. So for example, if there was a definition that was somehow like super predictable, like this is in all the dictionaries and whatever, and it made debates completely unworkable if you used this. It was like substantially is like $2 quadrillion, and like every dictionary has that like exact number. It's like that's probably not what we're going for, right? There's a piece of debatability that like informs accuracy, but that's mostly thinking about like what are the topic committee thinking about when they're putting together this wording, right? Um,
does it matter? Like, why do we care what they thought?
uh, well, it's. I think it matters when you're trying to decipher what this means when you're
Right.
there to debate about it,
That's
right?
yeah.
Um,
This
like
is like an
maybe,
ancient text that we're translating.
yeah, exactly. Um, in terms of let's talk about substance.
Let's do it.
So on the pro, I just wrote some stuff down quickly. I was like, everyone's going to talk about warming. Uh, this is probably bait. Uh, I can talk about why I think it's bait later, but I just think that the level of nuclear in our power mix is so low, the contribution of other countries is so high to warming. You could make an argument about modeling, Uh, in the Trump era, it's kind of tough. Like, there's just a lot of reasons why I think the warming stuff is bait, and the defense is very good. Um, so it's, I mean, I don't think it's entirely bait, but I just don't think it's actually going to be as good in practice as people like. It's obviously the topic argument,
Right.
but I would think outside the box. I was thinking about competitiveness. So thinking about how nuclear energy shapes our role as an energy leader. So this is not a warming impact per se, but this is about like global norms, global leadership in energy being important geopolitically. I think all of the geopolitical energy literature is like very rich and very important. There's some also stuff about how nuclear can be distinguished. Like this might be kind of an advanced argument to make, but uh, nuclear energy is more reliable than solar or wind, which is really important when we're thinking about like cyber attacks, when we're thinking about cutoffs from other countries being used to leverage geopolitically. And so you can make this like renewable transition inevitable, but without nuclear, we're sort of weak geopolitically,
I see.
and nuclear is actually safer. Uh,
Hmm.
I think is decent. There's also some standard setting stuff. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is kind of behind in terms of exporting our nuclear stuff to the rest of the world. So it seems like if we invested more in it, we might be able to deploy that. This goes to like the SMR stuff too, where it's just
Yeah.
like, yeah,
That's interesting. How would you frame that with T domestic?
yeah. So I would make the argument that the main reason we're lagging in terms of our nuclear regulatory standards is we have a lack of investment in our domestic capacity. And
Mhm.
so it's sort of just a consequence of increased domestic investment that we would have better standards and have more leadership, be perceived as like more important with our leadership with our standards to export that to the rest of the world.
That
So it's
makes
not where, yeah. Um, and then, yeah, a general energy transition stuff. I think this is probably the best arguments, like stuff about there's inevitable oil shocks. There's like dependence on like Middle East, Russia, like, and so energy independence is specifically important for geopolitical vulnerability. So I think the best arguments are probably geopolitical.
that makes sense. That's interesting. What do you think are the best like scenarios for geopolitics impacts?
Yeah, I think I haven't again, I really haven't touched this lit in a while. But I think that focusing on uh things that are somewhat framed as inevitable by these sort of analysts, where it's just like there will be oil shocks in the future, they're coming, right? And we need some sort of way to ration energy or like an energy source that's good. And maybe they're not going to even talk about nuclear specifically, but it doesn't matter because what matters is that we're not transitioning effectively to renewables now. So this is our only shot. Um, yeah, I think that's about it. There was some more specific stuff, but I'm not going to be able to remember off the top of my head for the like standard setting, like NRC stuff. But it's definitely out there, and I would look into it.
Cool.
Um,
And for the con,
yeah. So the con,
I gotta stop
politics.
neg now.
Yeah, yeah. So I think some kind of politics argument is probably going to be good. I actually think the politics disadvantage might be realer
Mhm.
in PF than it is in policy, which is strange to say. And the reason is because the sort of intrinsicness arguments kind of grow out of the like existential statement stuff, but they don't really apply in a world of pros and cons where the political capital investment for this is a real con of doing it. Uh, so I think politics is a good argument. Everyone hates nuclear. Like if you look at Germany, like everyone hates nuclear. No one wants to build nuclear. Um, so I think it would actually be really bad politically. Uh, I think the meltdown stuff is kind of bait. Like, I think the only version of meltdowns that's good is the terror stuff. Anything cyber, like, because the thing is, the pro lit is just going to be much better on the question of nuclear safety because there's
Yeah.
way more people arguing why. Like the I'm sure actually in PF it might be different because the amount of like paraphrased evidence from psychos writing on websites from 2002 is going to be off the charts and I think it's gonna be very important to call these people out.
Ironically, paraphrasing is not as much of a norm in PF, which I think is a bad thing. Like I actually am a
Wait,
paraphrase fan.
that's like, are we doing this?
We can set this aside for now, and we'll have a heated discussion about it in a bit. I do feel somewhat strongly, especially now that I have seen what PF looks like without paraphrasing. But you're completely right about the 2002 psychos. Like that's just everything that people are.
Like that's like most of the con evidence.
Yeah.
Like it's tough. No counterplans? Really? No
Okay, I guess.
counterplans?
I mean, it
Okay,
depends. If you want to abuse like the weird thing in the rules that's like probably not supposed to be there, or do you want to be a good person?
Splauner plans. My Splauner plan would be invest in different renewables that aren't nuclear, and then read specific to nuclear scenarios like terror. Uh, Seems good. Uh, what else? Like I really haven't thought that much about the politic, like the downsides of nuclear energy, because there probably aren't that many.
True.
Uh, where do don't we have enough? Like, where do we get our uranium from?
I think a lot of it is actually from like Russia.
Isn't it domestic? Well, okay, that seems like a really pretty decent interdependence downside. So the way you want to go for this interdependence stuff is you're just like interdependence is bad. It's weaponized interdependence. So traditionally, interdependence. This is you also want to turn it on the pro. So here's how you turn it on the pro. Interdependence is good because when countries trade with each other, they don't go to war.
Right, right.
And then on the con, you're just like, well, weaponized interdependence. We've read Farrell and Abraham. I don't remember. And we know that when great powers trade with each other, they can use trade as leverage to go after smaller countries like Russia and Ukraine, or China and Taiwan, maybe.
Yeah.
And so that's the argument I would make regarding the nuclear trade is it's not that Russia will attack us, but they'll use it as leverage to try and go after the Baltics or something. We're not going to trade Toledo for some Toronto 51st state. Okay.
True. So wait, to be clear about that, like the scenario would literally be like Russia. We are so dependent on Russia for uranium, that when Russia, like, yeah, I don't know, invades
No,
Estonia.
no, 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 no. It's all perception based. So it's we become dependent for uranium on Russia. Russia thinks because we're dependent on them for uranium and don't want to get cut off,
I see.
they have the coercive leverage to go after the Baltics without us getting involved.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. What was the next thing you were gonna say?
I don't remember my con. I literally have nothing on my con list. If you give me some arguments, I can tell you if they're good or bad. Vibes
Okay,
based, but
that's fair. I'll do that with one, and then I'll move on to another more specific
okay,
question.
great.
I've been trying to cook this argument on the con. I don't know if it works or if it's too much
Okay,
of a stretch. The argument is investing more in nuclear energy might actually be bad for nuclear energy, if it comes from the government. There's like a number of reasons why. It sounds like a whack argument.
oh, it's the privatization good stuff.
Yeah, that's part of it, right? Like nationalization, it's not quite nationalization, but like that vibe is bad.
Those standards are kind of stifling, right? Because that money. The problem is, it's really tough if you don't have a counterplan. Like, it's really tough without
Well, okay.
relative to the squo.
You keep saying counterplan, but I feel like the squo is something that you can defend if you just have a lot of evidence about how it might trend better in the future. Like this is like the uniqueness counterplan you were talking about.
Yeah. It's called the status quo counterplan.
Right. Yeah.
That's how it's talked about in the policy literature.
Yeah, which it doesn't actually really make sense to me. It's just like the
Well, it's not a counterplan at all.
yeah, right. It's just like
Yeah.
fast
Yeah, no,
forward.
I think with good framing arguments where it's just like we have this budding nuclear industry, right, that is privatized and they are lobbying the government to ease the standards now, but funding it through the government means we crush that
Yeah.
and we stifle the innovation.
Yeah, I think there are three different narratives that you can pair together here. One is like slow and steady wins the race. Like current nuclear sector is growing gradually. That allows for protections and safety measures to keep pace. But if you rush it, then like
Okay, no, that one's bad. Uh, the reason why that one's bad is it doesn't work with the other narratives, and I think it's just not as good because the whole point with the other narratives is that the government's safety and other standards are too demanding,
right. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense.
and
Like
they
those
crowd out innovation in the private sector.
yeah, that's fair. So maybe don't read it with safety stuff, but okay. The other two are like Trump administration specifically is bad. So this is where we get into some of the PF specific stuff. Because like in policy, this doesn't actually make any sense as an argument because the AF just says, nah, we're not going to do it that way. But in PF, you can just say on the con, like when the Trump administration increases investment in domestic nuclear energy, it looks like this, and this is specifically bad. Like
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
it would be
yeah.
good for other
You
administrations.
can you get to characterize the normal means
Yeah,
just as much as the pro does, right?
exactly. And I think that there's good ground for the con to do this. Um,
Yeah.
both like rhetorical
So
posture.
wait, what's up with the Trump administration doing this though? I understand.
So
I understand the
yeah,
argument, but
yeah, yeah. Yeah. There are a few things. Besides the rhetorical posturing, which actually I think is quite strong,
yeah,
for many, like as just a basis of a narrative to persuade many judges. Like you'd be, I don't know, like there are still going to be parent judges at the
no,
TOC.
I'm buying it. I'm buying it. I'm
Yeah.
buying it. But
Okay.
I
Cool,
want
cool,
what's
cool.
the impact?
Yeah, the impact, there are a lot of different ones. One is like you can magnify every DA and gain uniqueness off of how the private sector is better than the Trump. Like the narrative is like when the Trump administration takes the reins of this budding nuclear sector, then it comes with deregulation. It comes with like a race.
Yeah, yeah. So that's like mutually exclusive with the first one. But oh,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And it's a little
But
bit
yeah, it's
weird
good.
because it's also mutually exclusive with the other set of links we were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's safety stuff.
right.
Well, I mean, one of them is yes, no nuclear, right? And
Mhm.
this one is like Squo nuclear versus Trump
Yeah, I
nuclear.
mean, I think in order for any of these to be good, they have to be nuanced. They can't just be yes, no nuclear. The goal is for the impact scenarios at the end of each of these to result in less nuclear, but to also be able to retain your disad ground and say that their nuclear is actively bad. Um,
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I think that that second one would work totally fine, right? Because
yeah,
it's just like not only are we
right.
doing more nuclear, which is bad, but the way in which we're doing nuclear is also bad.
Right, right.
So
I
I think
think
it works.
there's a cool trick with it too, where like it seems like a lot of the Trump administration's nuclear plans are specifically to like do things like co-locate nuclear reactors with like AI data centers or like add like
Oh, that
small
seems like a bad idea.
right. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, independently you get your
No,
own
I
like
like that.
AI.
I like that. That's like a really good way to link into the geopolitical
Right,
disadvantages,
right.
right? Where
Yeah,
it's just
that's
like, yeah,
wonderful. And the thing is, if we're doing that, then we're not necessarily getting a lot of the AF advantages. For example,
exactly, exactly.
we're not making major nuclear inroads into decarbonizing the grid. We're just like giving Amazon free baby
Give
nuclear.
it to Bitcoin miners.
Yeah, exactly, right? So this like
That's good.
maybe they still retain a marginal link on warming, but like all
No,
the
no, but that's you have inroads into the case. I think that's great. Yeah, that sounds good. I like that a lot.
nice. What was the third one? First one is slow and steady. Second one is
Trump.
don't give Trump the reins. Um, third one is the private versus national.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Like,
I think a lot of judges are gonna have a hard time buying this. Uh because so the biggest problem with this is that it's very hard to pair with yes no nuclear
yeah, right, right,
because you're yeah with that offense because you want to say that the squo is gonna do nuclear better in a lot of like so this is I think of it kind of like you're straight turning nuclear in
yeah,
a way like all the nuclear good stuff. So I would never say this speaking first,
hmm
but I might say this speaking second. Um, if that makes sense.
yeah.
Because it's just like if you say this speaking first,
They
then
could just, yeah, they could
they can just directly take you up on the like private versus public thing. But if you say this speaking second, they are already committed to all of their nuclear
just,
good for warming or whatever.
right. Their first
Yeah.
speech just goes away, I guess.
Yeah, 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 yeah. You make it all about what you want to talk about, which is generally how good debates go.
Yeah, pretty nice, pretty nice. Um, Last thing I wanted to ask, what do you think are some particularly bad arguments on this topic that you think will nonetheless be common?
Ooh, I see. I don't think about bad arguments. So bad arguments on this topic that'll be common. On the pro, uh, as I said, I think some of the warming stuff is kind of bait.
Hmm.
Um, I think on the con, as it, there's just gonna be so much just like pure. Like I think some of these websites are gonna be like evidence ethicsable. Like it's gonna be so bad. It's gonna be because I've looked at this literature. Like it is the people on both sides of this debate are freaky. They're freaky. Like it's crazy. Especially on the con side. So I just think there's just going to be a lot of like just insane warrants where it's just like, have you heard of the like sky explosion disad? Like it destroys the ozone layer, like the whole thing at once. Like yeah, like Sarg nuclear hurricane type stuff. Um, so yeah, I think there's just going to be some really out there stuff
Hmm.
on both sides, but I think that the core of topic arguments are all seemed pretty solid, at least on the pro side.
Oh, I know
Um,
you didn't talk about nuclear waste.
I think that that is best as like the link into Set Col and like
Right.
stuff like that. Like I think the actual weighability in a normal debate is going to be really tough.
Yeah, you need the
Um,
frame.
I think the best way that the pro should do it is thinking about increased investment means also we're investing in waste disposal because we're the government
Yeah.
and we like to do that and the private sector doesn't. So that's how I'd answer all these turns, and that's probably the main way to set call. So I think that the waste stuff as a policy argument, not good. Waste stuff with some framing arguments, critical stuff, good. Uh
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, I one more question about the waste argument then.
yeah.
Um, I foresee one of the biggest problems with it is like it probably loses most rounds against like fossil fuels just produce worse waste. Um, One, like, what are your thoughts on that pragmatically? But second of all, do you think there's any teeth to like a action and no action and action distinction or yes action action distinction argument for like
Uh
framing? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think regarding fossil fuels worse, I think it's very different.
Mhm.
Like in terms of the type of criticism of nuclear waste, like I don't think the fossil fuel stuff interacts as directly with the colonialism arguments.
Mhm.
But also the kind of waste nuclear waste is just very different from the atmospheric effects of carbon from burning fossil fuels. So I and also could potentially be harder to get rid of. Like we have CCS, but we still don't really have great waste siting. I mean, our CCS is kind of bad, but uh, it's getting better. So in terms of the action stuff, I'm not really sure why it's relevant. It seems like it would just be linear, where it's just like uh, the more waste it increases, the worse. Uh,
I
Same
guess
for
the
like
argument would just be like, perhaps this increases, like perhaps increasing nuclear waste, or like increasing nuclear energy actively kills marginalized people, and it also results eventually in saving marginalized people. But the argument would be this is still like an immoral thing to do.
oh, so it's like the opposite of the doctrine of double effect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think if you're a utilitarian, it doesn't matter. Uh, yeah. On the negative, I think that argument is better, but must be paired with a framing argument.
Right,
Like
right.
the my biggest issue with neg critiques that don't use the standard like policy style framework stuff is that they do not have a theory of ethics or any
Right.
way for the judge to weigh their stuff. So you need to just be like, colonialism is a side constraint, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Colonialism is not something you can endorse, even if they're speculatively decreasing some of the effects of colonialism later. So I think that has potential, but I think it needs to be tied very specifically into some sort of ethical argument.
Yeah, 100%. I got you. Any last takes on nuclear energy?
Um, I think this topic kind of sucks. Like, uh, it's it it's nice insofar as I think it's limited, and so I think there's going to be some pretty in-depth debates at the TOC on these issues, and the stuff for researching most of the issues is fairly accessible. Like there's been a lot of policy debate on this, not necessarily the event, but I so I think that's nice, and I think there are some decent sort of there's like a pretty good range of ground on both sides.
Mhm.
Something I would look into is the degrowth critiques of ecomodernism. Often include critiques of nuclear energy, since that's kind of a key tenet of the eco-modernist vision. Uh, they've sort of been on the case for, and
How do
that's
you
that's most.
like if I want to go find them, how do I find them?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you some links, but I would just look up if you know how to Google, just like with quotes, like degrowth, eco-modernism, like nuclear will probably get you something pretty good. Maybe the Cardano paper. Is that the first response? I've read way too much of this literature.
Okay.
uh, it is.
I think it's
Yeah.
cool. I don't know. I haven't read shit.
Yeah.
Um,
So this is this. There's like a section of this
okay.
in here.
Okay, lit.
But I can link something better. Because this went down. But basically, there's a lot of really good. That debate has included a lot of other stuff that's
Mhm.
important, but specifically the debate of renewables has been really in depth on both sides. So,
Nice.
like people like Breakthrough Institute are big nuclear shills. Ted Nordhaus, um, Michael Schellenberger.
Nice.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I can send you some links.
Are we gonna do this? Are we gonna debate about paraphrasing in public forum?
Sure. Well, okay. Look, let me make some initial things there. One, I think I used to be much more against it than I am now. Um, two, I was actually very surprised when you were like, "There's not enough paraphrasing in PF," and I was like, "Huh?" Because the thing is, I'm kind of mixed because I think that the abuses of paraphrasing are just really bad,
Mhm.
like irredeemably bad. Like the thing is, it's like I just don't think the benefits outweigh the downsides.
Uh-huh.
But like, it's it's legal. Like,
Yeah.
it's in the rules. You can do it. like I I'm sort of split because it's like I can't in good conscience be like don't do it whatsoever. And I think especially in front of some judges, like it's fine. Like I don't know how to tell debaters this who've debated on the circuit. Like parent judges do not read your evidence. They do not read cards. like and this goes for like not just parent judges. Like there's a good amount of like tab judges who are just flowing your speeches and are not reading your cards.
Bro,
And
I
so they're
refuse.
not.
Okay, I have an even hotter take about this. I actively refuse to read cards unless someone like tells me in the round you must read this card. And I think I stand by that completely. I think that it is like massively interventionist to comb through all of the evidence after a debate.
Maybe this is coming from a different background. I have the opposite thing. I read every card read in the debate.
We're quite a bit past our
Yeah.
do you have any last wisdom to dispense to our audience?
Okay. Wisdom. It's so late. um, debate is about the judge. Cut more cards. Don't recut cards just to recut them. Do it to learn something. Uh, debate starts with backwards induction. Learn game theory. Uh, do more weighing. Critiques are cheating. Uh, yeah, that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being on, Evan. I feel like we've learned a lot from you. I hope that everyone here has gained some new understanding of debate. Thanks for
All right.
like solving the activity of PF.
Yeah.
I
Thanks
appreciate
for
it.
having me on. Hopefully I can contribute to, yeah, truth and
100%.
justice.
Yeah. The um the collective knowledge of public forum debaters has grown today. Thanks.
I hope so.
Okay,
Uh,
see you later.